rates and cost allocation. This is the training that we, I believe, show quarterly. So if this is a repeat for you, I apologize, but it's just a good training to refresh everyone's mind regarding indirects because we always get questions, and it can be a really kind of complex and not an easy topic. So um, this is the reason why we wanted to just bring this training up again every quarter just to refresh everyone's mind. With that, I am going to share my screen, and let me see if I can make this. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to see if I can make this. Okay, are you able to see my screen? I think you can. So again, this is just my information here, and today we are going to be talking about the cost allocation and cost type, how to recover your indirect cost. I'm also going to talk about the minimus rate, and give you some information regarding indirect rates and base types, some required documentation that should be sent to us when you are sending your proposals for our review. And then I'll also provide some really basic example of how to calculate your indirect rate. So this is just a slide to CFR 200. Again, it's a resource for you to have because we do follow to CFR 200 when it comes to indirect rates. So cost allocation. Cost allocation basically means just assigning grouping costs that are similar costs that have a similar objective into different pools. It's very important that when it comes to cost allocation that you have documentation because one of the requirements for 2 CFR 200 is that there has to be some standard in how you're allocating your costs, which means that if you are allocating a certain cost as indirect cost, switching that cost now to direct cost and making those changes frequently is not something that's allowable. And if you do have to, change the way that you're allocating certain costs, that's something that has to be approved by your cognizant agency. So the agency that's reviewing your indirect proposal. So it's also very important that you keep all the supporting documentation because we have our fiscal monitoring staff when they go to do the site visits. That's probably something that they would ask to see if you have any documentation regarding your cost allocation policies. When it comes to cost allocation, it's also something that should be reviewed periodically because businesses change or the way that entities work, different businesses, and they're getting different funding. So it's very important to review those methodologies periodically. And it's also very important to remember that when it comes to allocating costs, it's not based on funds available. So it should truly be something that you allocate costs based on those cost objectives. And the rule of thumb is if you can directly charge your cost, that's always the best. And then again, to be consistent. So that's kind of what we talked about earlier, that you have to make sure that it's a standard and consistency in your cost allocation. So with that, there are basically three different types of costs. So we have direct costs. Those are the costs that are charged directly to the benefiting program. They vary, we know that they're only benefiting one program and one cost objective. So those are costs that we should be charged directly to that program. Then we have those shared costs. So there's some costs that benefit multiple different programs, so multiple different objectives. Those costs are usually allocated using some kind of allocation methodology, maybe FTE, square footage, or some methodology that's easy to, again, that's a standard methodology for your organization. Again, that methodology should be recorded. And if we ask for documentation, should be able to provide that documentation of your allocation methodology for those shared costs. And then we have indirect costs, which is the cost that we are talking about today. Again, those are usually charged using your approved indirect cost rate. And that example would be accounting, human resources. So those are the costs that benefit the whole organization, not just one project. I also included this slide just as a resource. These are some of this is 2 CFR 200 related to the unallowable costs. So those are the costs that are not allowable to be charged. So the options for recovering indirect costs. So if you are an entity that has a federal agency that's assigned as your cognizant agency, and that again based on the amount of federal funding that you receive, then all we need in that situation when it comes to DOH is your approval letter from your cognizant agency. So, for example, if HHS is your agency, then you will be submitting your proposals to them, and then you will send us a copy of the approval letter, and then we will honor that rate for any grants that you received from DOH. The second option is if you do not have an indirect cognizant agency, federal cognizant agency, because you don't meet the threshold amount for direct costs, then DOH will then automatically become your cognizant agency because we are a pass-through agency. So in that situation, you will send your proposals to us or to me, and you will send all your packet, all the proposal to us, and then DOH will review and approve your indirect rate, which will then be used for DOH grants. And also that rate could potentially be used for other, let's say if you have a contract with Department of DSHS or I don't know, Department of Commerce or whatever, they could potentially also honor that rate. They're not required to because it's not a federal rate, but in many instances they will honor the rate that's approved by DOH. Then we have the third option is the cost allocation plan. So again, this is going back to allocating your costs. So if you have a plan that's assigned and approved plan by your organization, which says that this is how we are going to allocate our costs, again, based maybe on FTEs or based on whatever methodology they use, that can be used in lieu of your indirect rate. I know there's some organizations that have the indirect rate as well as a cost allocation plan, and that's perfectly fine. But you can have one or the other, or you can have both. If you have cost allocation plan in that situation, we just ask that you send us a copy of your plan, and then we'll keep that for our records. And what usually happens is when we have our fiscal monitoring staff, when they go and do site visits, they will then ask you for a copy of that cost allocation plan, and then they will verify if you're following the plan, if you're allocating your costs according to the approved cost allocation plan. And then the last final option is the minimis rate. So if you are opting to use the minimis rate, it's up to 15% of your modified total direct cost. You are able to do that as well. We just ask that you notify us, and then we do have a certification that we will send to you that you will complete. You will elect the percentage. Again, it's up to 15%. It can be less than 15%, whatever percentage that you indicate. You will sign that certification, send it to us, and we'll keep that for our record. The minimum certifications are good indefinitely, so you are not required to submit those certifications annually. So you will just continue using the minimum rate until you decide to move into different methodologies. So we will just continue using the minimum rate. So this is kind of just a slide regarding the cognizant agency. So I talked about the threshold. So if you're receiving more than 35 million in direct federal funding, then most likely you will have a federal cognizant agency that's assigned to you, who will then be reviewing and approving your indirect rate. So This is the minimum rate slide. Again, we kind of talked about this already. So it's 15% modified total direct cost, and I will go into this MTDC a little bit further in my presentation. You have to still comply with your CFR 200, so you still have to look at see if the cost is allowable or unallowable based on to CFR 200. You can opt for the minimum rate if you do not currently have a negotiated indirect cost rate. So that's something that you will communicate with us. We are not required, we're not, it's not subject to our review approval. You're not required to submit any supporting documentation the way you do it with the indirect rate. But again, we just ask that you notify us, and then we do have the certification that we will send to you, which you will be able to use. Definitely. So this is kind of just a reminder for the entities that submit their indirect rates to us or indirect proposals to us. Per 2 CFR 200, indirect rate proposals are due 6 months prior to the beginning of your fiscal year. So it can be a calendar year or state fiscal year. I've also seen some entities that utilize the federal fiscal year. Um, so again, just to keep in mind that they're due 6 months prior to the beginning of your fiscal year. So I know there are many entities that operate on the calendar year, and the proposals technically were due July of last year, because again, 6 months prior. However, if you still have outstanding indirect proposal, if you do not have approved rate for 2026 calendar year, please send those proposals as soon as possible so we can review those and send you the approval letters prior to you starting to build for 2026. If it happens that you do not have your indirect proposal, we have not reviewed it and approved it, and you bill for 2026, just keep in mind that we will still process your invoice and we will still pay your invoice. However, we will only be able to pay for direct cost. So we will not be able to pay for indirect cost until we get that rate for 2026 approved. So just a reminder. So what to submit with your proposal. So I usually your proposals come directly to me, or maybe you're using the subrecipient indirect inbox, which both options are fine. And a lot of times I know that I worked with many of you, but I would like ask for additional documentation. So it could be maybe like usually we ask for org charts, maybe some indirect cost policy statement. We ask for personnel cost worksheet and allocation. We also ask if there are any significant changes made for your in your fiscal year. Maybe you're changing the accounting system, or there were some changes to allocation methodology, or maybe you are adding some additional costs that were not there before because you have some different circumstances. So those are some of the things that we need to know, because it just helps when we do the review to make sure that everything is accurate. And if there's something missing, again, I always reach out to you and ask you for that documentation and for additional information. Let's see here. So again, this is just kind of like financial reports. We do ask for whatever you're using for your proposal. So it could be audited financial statements, budget, accounting reports, so any kind of financial reports that you were able to submit. That's something that we would need, because what usually happens is whatever you were indicating in your calculations for indirect rate, I do need to make sure that those financials and those totals reconcile with your financial reports that you're submitting. So many times, like if I get the reports and I'm not able to reconcile, and again, it's just because sometimes it's really hard if I get my PDF files and I'm trying to reconcile and I'm trying to find that information. Many times I will reach out to you directly just to help me understand and walk me through your process, and everybody's been really helpful, and I really appreciate every time I reach out with questions, I always get responses and help. So let's see here. Org chart, we talked about that. Oh, one important thing to remember is per 2 CFR 200, we do need to have your certification of indirect cost. It's just a one pager. There's a specific language that's listed in 2 CFR 200 that has to be included. And it's just you certifying that information that's submitted is accurate. That, this is the information that you're using to come up with your cost. And it just has to be signed by whoever has the signing authority for the indirect cost and for your financials. They will sign certifying, and that needs to be submitted with your indirect proposal. I do have a, a copy of the language, just like a template. So if that's something that you need, you can reach out to me and I will be able to send you that Word document or PDF that you can use for certification. So, okay, so next is, you've heard me talk about MTDC. So with your indirect rate, there is one thing that, varies between different entities, and that's your base. So basically, what are you using as your base to calculate the indirect rate? And base also means what are those costs that you are able to claim your indirect, that you're able to apply your indirect rate to. So one of the most common is direct salaries and wages. Just to keep in mind that for direct salaries and wages, fringe benefits are not included because it's just the wages. Then we have direct salaries and benefits. In that, we have the salaries and fringe benefits that are both included in the base. The modified total direct cost, that one is the one that's used for the minimus rate. One thing to keep in mind with the modified total direct cost that we've seen happen from time to time is rental costs are excluded from modified total direct cost. So you will not be able to claim rental, or you will not be able to earn indirects on your rental costs. However, you can still allocate your rental cost based on your allocation methodology. And then the final base is total direct cost, which is kind of similar to modified total direct cost, with that you have to exclude the capital expenditures and pass-through funds. So we also have different indirect rate types. So depending on your organization, depending on what are you using to come up with your rate, then that's how we determine which rate type to approve. Provisional is, again, just the interim rate that's used for that billing period. It's usually based on maybe like some budget. It's based on a combination of different things. And that's the rate that you should be reconciling. So usually you have a provisional and final. Like for DOH, for example, that's how we operate. We have received a provisional rate from HHS, and we use that for the fiscal year. And then after the fiscal year end, we go back and then we reconcile. We apply for a final rate, which sometimes provisional and final rate could end up not being the same. Which is fine. They don't have to be the same, and that's the reason why we have to go back and reconcile to make sure that there's a record of that. Then we have predetermined rate. That one, I think most of the entities are on predetermined rate, and that's the rate that's usually used that you are projecting, or you are submitting for a rate based on your prior fiscal year's actuals. So, for example, if you are applying for 2026 calendar year, most likely using either 2025 or 2024 actuals to then project to determine what your rate is going to be for the following fiscal year. And then I know there's some entities that also use fixed with carry forward rate, which is kind of like predetermined rate, but you're projecting it, and then when you're reconciling, you are adjusting your amounts based on what actually happened based on your actuals. So there's a worksheet that's usually required to be submitted with the fixed rate carry forward rate. And it's just kind of showing this is the rate that we had in prior fiscal year. This is what we should have recovered, and then you are carrying forward that, adjusting for that amount, either you're over or under recovered based on your calculation. So next we are moving, and I don't know if there are any questions because I'm sharing my screen. So if you don't mind, I think we'll just do questions at the end. But you feel free to enter your questions in the chat, and then I'll make sure once I'm done sharing my screen, I'll go back and verify and try to answer your questions. So we are moving on to the indirect cost rate steps. So this is just a really high level. Again, every organization is different. I know many of you maybe use contractor who develops your rates. Whatever your organization is, it's fine, and whatever process and steps that you use for your indirect rate. If it works for you, that's fine. But again, it's just a really high level what the indirect rate, like what steps you should be doing for indirect rate. The first is you're listing all your direct and indirect cost. Then you're kind of looking and see which costs are unallowable. So the big one will be like advertising. Um, some advertising costs are allowable and the majority are not. Then you would look at, any other unallowable costs for 2 CFR 200. So you will make sure to remove those. Then you're also looking at which base you're going to select. Again, this is completely up to your individual organizations. You don't, there's no one fit all kind of size. So it just depends on what works for you. And then you are going to add direct cost base, and then you are going to, separate your indirect cost from the total. And again, make sure that everything reconciles. And then you're dividing your indirect cost by your direct cost base to determine your rate, and then you are applying that rate to each program's direct cost. Again, this is just a quick example of these steps. So in this example, we have, again, very, very basic. We have indirect cost, direct cost, and then, of course, we have a total cost. We can see that in this example, we have advertising costs that are unallowable. So then we would remove that. And this slide just shows an example of how the calculation look like based on those numbers. And then based on the base that you're using. So if you're using a total direct cost, you will come up with different numbers versus salaries and wages. So again, whatever works for your organization, but just to keep in mind that if you're, for example, selecting total salaries and benefits, you're only able to claim indirect cost on you're applying indirect rate to the salaries and benefits. Let's see here. And then when it comes to subrecipient billing, again, we kind of talked about this when we were talking about reminders for indirect rate. But, for example, the 2026, you're going to probably start billing in the next, maybe next month, or you're billing quarterly, whatever the billing cadence for organization is. But one thing we just have to keep in mind is, do we have an indirect rate on file? So if you're submitting your rate, or electing to use the minimus, whatever your situation is, just to make sure that we have that on file. Then you will also just look to make sure that indirect rate is being applied accurately to your allowable expenditures. You will include any detailed information that's required, any backup documentation required based on your risk level, and then you will submit all of that documentation to us, and then we process your billing. That's the end of my slide. Here is my contact information. Again, you can email me directly, or you can also send your information to the subrecipient inbox. I monitor the inbox, and I also have a backup just in case if I'm not there. But both options are fine for questions. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to look and see if there are any questions. Let's see. I don't see any questions in chat, but I don't know if there are any questions in that you want to ask regarding indirect. Okay, I think then that ends today's training. I believe Debbie will be sharing the training slide with the group, but you can also email me directly and I'll be happy to send these slides to you